Hello, my name is Sophie Fletcher. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist, a doula of over 15 years experience, and the author of the best-selling book, Mindful Hypnobirthing. Now, today I'm going to tackle the question of vaginal examinations and hypnobirthing. Now, I have speaking to a midwife yesterday who was saying she gets all these letters with people being told not to consent to a vaginal examination if they're doing hypnobirthing. It should be around informed consent. And it's not as simple as just saying no. What is really empowering about hypnobirthing and what really contributes to having a positive birth is informed consent. And that's having the knowledge and understanding why you have decided or not decided to have a certain intervention. And vaginal examinations are an intervention. And I don't think there is much difference between someone saying you must have a vaginal examination between someone saying don't have a vaginal examination. Neither of those are informed consent. So in this video, I am going to talk to you about the psychology of vaginal examinations and how hypnosis and hypnobirthing can help you with informed choice and have a positive experience. So let's get started. Why do we think of how many centimeters dilated we are and how that assesses our progress? Now, this is a really interesting question, and I'd like you to really stop and think about it for a moment, because the research upon which this is based is really, really old. I mean, really old. It was 1950s, 1955 to be precise. And it was a doctor called Friedman who, I mean, you may have heard of Friedman's curve, which is a curve which we often today, even today, measure dilation versus progress. And Friedman, in a hospital in America, assessed around 500 women based on cervical dilation and progress in a trial that would not be allowed today for ethical reasons. First of all those women were white because it was 1955 and segregation was still in place. Over 90% of those women were sedated in some way, either mildly, moderately, or heavily sedated. And in those days, they used a drug which induced something called twilight sleep. So women would be given this drug and, almost like locked inside their body. They weren't able to communicate what they wanted. It was pretty brutal. And during this time, they were given many internal examinations, and over 50% of these babies were born through forceps delivery. And it was done very differently then. So babies, they used the forceps much higher than they would now, which means those babies would be born a lot quicker than they are now. So very, very different processes in place. So the parameters of that study just would not apply today. And over 50% of women having their first baby today, based on that study, would be having what would be known as abnormally slow labors, which is just not true. They would be having very normal labors based on today's standard and today's research. So why do we still use Friedman's curve? I mean, it's not used in every country, but it's used in a lot of countries. And take the UK, where I am, for example. It takes on average around 17 years from a research study to make it into policy and everyday practice in a hospital. It's the same in education as well. So it takes a long time for that research to trickle down, be implemented, for people to be trained in it, and for it to become a policy. And so we're really just starting to look at the research from around 2010 now, starting to see that implemented in policy. So the things that you might notice are the 4 to 6 phrase. So before, when I had my babies 20 years ago, 4 centimeters was considered to be going into active labor, whereas now that would be more accurate at around 6 centimeters. And at that point, labor starts to speed up as things really start to move on, and that oxytocin cycle, that feedback loop is really starting to bed down in the body. So first of all, the parameters of that study would not be used today. But it's so fixed in our minds culturally that how far we dilate is how far we progress. The reality is that dilation, progress are not tied together. Progress can be measured in lots of other ways. It's how you're moving, it's the noises you're making, it's a physiological experience you're having. You may not be dilating a lot, but your cervix may be thinning beautifully. So if you hear that from the midwife, it's a yay, something really is happening. Although birth is a linear process, how you move along that is very different depending on your own unique physiology, but also your psychology, how your thoughts and feelings around birth can influence this, which is why methods like hypnobirthing preparation can be really beneficial. Any fears or anxieties that you have can actually slow labor down and slow that progress. Whereas if you feel confident, relaxed, trusting in your body, feel that you have informed consent, that process can speed up because you've got more oxytocin flowing through your body. So the psychology is really, really important. Where do vaginal examinations fit into all of this? And why do we still have so many? If you're having a home birth and you have a home birth midwife who is there with you one-to-one, you are much less likely to be offered a vaginal examination. It's something that is, I think, a real massive benefit of a home birth. If you're in hospital, there are perhaps different procedures and policies in place. The midwife may be supporting more couples than you. So falling into that progress through dilation can happen because that's just the policy. That might be how they've always done. It might be how they've been taught. But also it just helps them when they're not in the room with you all the time, looking at your movement, assessing the sounds you're making, the physiological progress you're making in other ways. And it can be really helpful to have a doula when you're in a hospital, actually, because a doula can tap into that sixth sense and that kind of sense, of just knowing how you're progressing. And I've seen this, as I am a doula, I have been at births, and I've seen midwives spring into action on just hearing something differently. I've done things for the couples that I've worked with, the mother who's birthing, that I've done instinctively. And afterwards she said to me, how did you know I needed that at that point? You really can tune into that. And progress is something you can tune into as a midwife, a birth worker, someone who knows that woman really well. So what are your options? Now, obviously, one of your options is just to not consent to any vaginal examinations. One of them is to consent to them and not know the result. And the other one is to consent to them and know the result. So I'm going to kind of go through all of those and just talk to you about the physiological and the psychological aspects of those three choices, so you are really well informed. So the first aspect is declining all vaginal examinations. Personally, if I were having a home birth, this is what I would do, and in hospital, unless I really felt I needed it, simply because I'm the sort of person that goes like that when I have a smear test. I know that knowing that is going to make absolutely no difference to how I am progressing. And I understand the research. I just don't want someone else's fingers inside of me. I think it's very personal. I think it's a very intimate thing. And if it's not necessary, I just don't want it to happen. But that's my choice. I also know, and this is one thing I want you to know, is that vaginal examinations can lead to further intervention. There is something called the cascade of intervention. And if the midwives don't think you're progressing like as they would like to see you progressing, you may be offered further intervention to speed things up. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in these sections. So declining vaginal examinations, you can decline them. It's within your rights to do that. You should never be told, well, we can't let you into the unit until we know how far you're dilated, because actually how far you're dilated has no bearing on when you're going to have your baby, but also that is a form of coercion. So you should, if you hear that, just put your foot down and say, I don't consent. I have one story of a mother who this happened to. It wasn't her first baby, it's her second, and she just felt that things were happening quite quickly, and she felt quite far along. And she'd had another baby before. She was very alert to the signs, and she went in and she was examined, and they said, no, you're not dilated at all. You've got a while, go home, get comfortable, all that, all those things. And she refused because she knew deep down that things were happening. And she sat in the waiting room and she had her baby an hour later. So really listen to that instinct, that feeling. If you want to be in the hospital unit because that's where instinctively you want to be, then it's the right place for you. You shouldn't have to have a vaginal examination to tell you that, because it's about being where you feel safe and comfortable. And when you feel safe, where you feel supported, when you are in the right place for you, then things will happen. So trust that. But the second choice is having vaginal examinations, but not knowing the result. Now, this is a really interesting approach because there are other things at play here. So if you're someone who feels you want the examinations, but knowing the results will make you get anxious. So if the midwife were to say to you, oh, you're only 3 centimeters dilated, how is that going to make you feel? It's really important to understand that, because if that makes you immediately feel defeated or deflated, then really consider whether you really want to know, or have one at all. So it's just thinking about those factors that play in. The interesting thing about choosing not to know the results and having an examination is that it's not just your thoughts and feelings at play here. The knowledge of the midwife or the doctor who is caring for you, their experiences, their beliefs, their training, will all play into what happens next. So depending on where you are, how you're progressing, it may lead to further interventions or suggestions for other care, based on their feelings. They may have anxiety about something that is founded in a previous experience. It may be there's pressure on them from a colleague, that you do not know what's going on in their background psychologically. So it's so interesting how all these things come into play. So even if you don't know how you're progressing, how they think you are progressing will have an impact on the care that you are offered. Really important to understand that. The third option is to have it and know it. If you really feel like knowing is going to help you, then in my mind, that means that you haven't got out of that mindset that knowing how far you've dilated means progress. It's a very, very personal choice, whether that's something that gives you sort of a psychological crutch, as it were, whether it makes you feel better. As long as you are resilient to the words, I'm only 3 centimeters dilated, that's fine. There may be medical reasons for having a vaginal examination. If this is the case, or if that's offered to you, really ask those questions. So this is a time to implement your brains, benefits, risks. What's the indication for that? What are the alternatives? What if we did nothing? So use that questioning framework to know that having an internal examination at that point really is the right choice for you and your baby. So let's go back to that. You've got 3 choices: the choice to decline, the choice to consent and not know how far dilated you are, and the third is to consent to a vaginal examination and know how far you're dilated, but really understanding all the things that are at play.
Read more in my book, Mindful Hypnobirthing. Visit my website, sophiefletcher.co.uk, where you'll find courses and new material, or visit me on Instagram at Mindful Hypnobirthing Book.